Aurora, the polar bear, was giving birth after a pregnancy that surprised everyone at the Arctic Wildlife Sanctuary. But what should have been a joyous moment turned into a tense and shocking situation when the staff realized something was wrong with one of her cubs. The team was forced to act, knowing the smallest mistake could have dangerous consequences. The Arctic Wildlife Sanctuary stood at the edge of the frozen tundra, surrounded by vast, white landscapes stretching endlessly in all directions. It was a remote haven for animals like Aurora, rescued from dire conditions and given a second chance at life. The facility's mission was to protect endangered species while helping people understand the delicate balance of Arctic ecosystems. Aurora had been at the sanctuary for 3 years. She had been saved from a dilapidated marine park where she'd spent years in a small concrete cage, performing tricks for food. When she first arrived at the sanctuary, she was underweight and wary of humans. Over time, she adapted to her new home, a large, semi-wild habitat designed to mimic the conditions of her natural Arctic environment. The staff admired Aurora's resilience. She thrived despite her rough past, but she kept her distance from humans and other polar bears, maintaining a solitary existence. That's why her pregnancy shocked everyone. Polar bears in captivity rarely conceive, and Aurora hadn't interacted with another bear since her arrival. Tests confirmed she was expecting, but how and when this had happened remained a mystery. Preparations for the birth began as soon as the team noticed changes in Aurora's behavior. She started digging in the snow, creating small dens, and spending more time in secluded corners of her habitat. Dr. Elena Ruiz, the lead veterinarian, explained that polar bears instinctively prepare dens for birthing. "She's following her instincts, which is a good sign," Elena had said during one of their observation sessions. Still, the pregnancy brought risks. Aurora was estimated to be around 10 years old, near the upper age limit for first-time mothers. Her history of malnourishment during captivity also raised concerns about her health and the cub's development. The team set up motion-sensitive cameras around her habitat, ensuring they could monitor her without disturbing her. As the Arctic winter intensified, Aurora's behavior became more erratic. She spent hours pacing near the edges of her enclosure, her massive white paws crunching through the ice. Her dark eyes, usually calm and calculating, appeared restless. "She knows something is coming," Ethan Keller, the sanctuary's lead animal behaviorist, observed one evening. The sanctuary team worked tirelessly to prepare for every possible outcome. They reinforced Aurora's habitat, ensuring her den was safe from the harsh winds that often reached hurricane speeds. A small, heated observation post was set up nearby, equipped with medical supplies in case of an emergency. On a bitterly cold evening, Aurora's restlessness escalated. The cameras showed her retreating to the largest of her dens, her massive frame barely fitting inside. From the observation post, the team watched anxiously. "This could be it," Elena whispered, her breath fogging up the glass as she leaned closer to the screen. The staff gathered in silence, their attention fixed on the monitor. Aurora shifted uncomfortably, her powerful body contracting in waves. Hours passed, and the tension in the room grew. The howling wind outside only added to the eerie atmosphere, as if nature itself was holding its breath. Finally, just before dawn, the first cub was born. The team erupted in quiet cheers as they watched the tiny, wiggling figure emerge. Aurora immediately began licking the cub, her rough tongue cleaning the fragile newborn and stimulating its first breaths. Within minutes, a second cub followed, slightly larger than the first, but just as lively. Aurora's instincts took over as she nuzzled her newborns, her massive paws surprisingly gentle as she positioned them against her warm belly. The staff shared relieved smiles. So far, everything was going smoothly. But as the first light of day crept over the icy horizon, Aurora's labor continued. A third cub was born, smaller than the others. This one didn't squirm or cry like its siblings. On the monitor, the staff watched as Aurora nudged the cub gently, her dark eyes filled with what looked like concern. "It's not moving," Ethan said, his voice tight. Elena leaned forward, her brow furrowing. "We'll give her time. She might be able to revive it on her own." The room grew quiet as they watched Aurora lick the lifeless cub, trying to encourage it to move. The minutes stretched on, and the team's initial relief gave way to a heavy sense of worry. Aurora eventually turned her attention back to her first 2 cubs, ensuring they were warm and fed. The third cub remained motionless, its tiny body dwarfed by Aurora's enormous form. The staff exchanged uneasy glances, knowing they might have to intervene if the situation didn't improve. Outside, the Arctic wind howled louder, a chilling reminder of how fragile life could be in such an unforgiving environment. As Aurora curled protectively around her cubs, the team braced themselves for the challenges ahead. The birth of Aurora's cubs was a miracle, but the struggle for survival had only just begun. Aurora's story wasn't just about survival. It was about the strength that had carried her through a life of hardship. Before arriving at the Arctic Wildlife Sanctuary, Aurora's life was anything but natural. She had been born in captivity, taken from her mother shortly after birth, and sold to a struggling marine park in the southern United States. The marine park was a world of artificial lights, chlorinated water, and crowds of spectators. Aurora was trained to perform tricks for food, enduring years of inadequate care and isolation. The concrete enclosure she called home was a far cry from the icy landscapes her instincts longed for. By the time she was rescued, she was malnourished, her white fur stained yellow, and her spirit seemingly broken. Her rescue had been part of a larger operation to shut down facilities exploiting marine and Arctic wildlife. When she arrived at the sanctuary, the staff had doubted whether she would ever adapt to her new environment. At first, Aurora showed little interest in exploring her spacious habitat. She spent days lying in one corner, her dull eyes watching the snow drift outside the enclosure's glass panels. Ethan Keller, the sanctuary's lead animal behaviorist, had taken a particular interest in Aurora. He spent hours observing her, taking detailed notes on her habits and reactions. "She's carrying years of trauma," he often told the team, "but I think there's still a spark in her." Aurora's breakthrough came one crisp autumn morning when she stepped outside her enclosure for the first time. The sanctuary had constructed an expansive, semi-wild habitat for her, complete with frozen ponds, snow-covered ridges, and even a small cave designed to mimic a polar bear den. Slowly, Aurora began to explore. She learned to fish in the icy water and hunt seals made of frozen meat, placed strategically around her habitat. These activities were meant to simulate her natural behaviors and strengthen her muscles after years of confinement. Her transformation was remarkable. Over the months, Aurora regained her strength, her fur grew thick and white, and her eyes became sharp and alert. Despite her progress, Aurora remained distant from the sanctuary staff. Unlike some of the other animals, she showed no interest in forming bonds with her caretakers. Her aloof nature earned her the nickname Queen of the Ice among the staff. Her pregnancy came as a complete surprise. Polar bears in captivity rarely reproduce, especially those with Aurora's history. Ethan had been the first to notice the subtle changes. She began eating more than usual and gaining weight at a rapid pace. Initially, the team thought it was due to the coming winter, as polar bears typically fatten up to survive the colder months. But as her belly rounded and her movements slowed, it became clear she was expecting. The sanctuary staff had no explanation for how she had become pregnant. Aurora had been alone since her arrival, and no male polar bears were kept at the facility. The only plausible theory was that Aurora had mated before her rescue, and her body had delayed implantation, a biological phenomenon in polar bears where fertilized eggs remain dormant until conditions are suitable for pregnancy. This theory made Aurora's pregnancy even more extraordinary. If true, it meant that Aurora had carried her cubs for years before her body decided the time was right to bring them into the world. As the team prepared for the birth, the stakes couldn't have been higher. Aurora wasn't just any polar bear, she was a symbol of hope for a species facing extinction due to climate change and human activity. Polar bears relied on sea ice for hunting and survival, but the ice was melting faster than ever. Every birth, every new life, carried immense significance. Aurora's pregnancy also reignited public interest in the sanctuary. News outlets ran stories about the miracle polar bear, and donations began pouring in to support the facility. The team used the funds to enhance Aurora's habitat and improve their monitoring equipment. Despite the excitement, there was an undercurrent of anxiety. Aurora's age and health history made her pregnancy high risk. Dr. Elena Ruiz, the sanctuary's lead veterinarian, had spent weeks studying polar bear births, consulting with experts around the world to prepare for every possible scenario. "We have to be ready for complications," she told the team during one of their planning sessions. As the due date approached, Aurora's behavior became increasingly erratic. She spent hours digging dens and rearranging snow piles, her instincts driving her to create the perfect space for her cubs. The staff observed her closely through remote cameras, careful not to disturb her. One evening, during one of these observation sessions, Ethan noticed something unusual. Aurora was pacing near the far edge of her habitat, her massive paws leaving deep prints in the snow. She paused to sniff the air, her black nose twitching, before letting out a low, guttural growl. "What's she doing?" Elena asked, peering over Ethan's shoulder at the monitor. "Hard to say," Ethan replied. "She might be sensing something we can't." Aurora's restlessness continued for days, heightening the tension among the staff. Then, one bitterly cold evening, she finally retreated to her largest den and didn't come out. The cameras showed her digging furiously, shaping the space for her cubs. "She's getting close," Elena said, her voice filled with a mix of excitement and worry. The team doubled their efforts, ensuring every piece of equipment was in place and every potential emergency scenario was accounted for. The sanctuary braced itself for what was to come, knowing the next few days could bring both joy and heartbreak. Aurora, the Queen of the Ice, was about to begin a new chapter in her extraordinary life. The Arctic winter was unforgiving, with the sun barely rising above the horizon for weeks at a time. The sanctuary was shrouded in darkness, illuminated only by the faint glow of the moon and stars reflecting off the endless expanse of snow. Inside her den, Aurora was preparing to give birth, her movements slow but deliberate. Outside, the sanctuary staff waited anxiously, knowing the long night ahead could bring both triumph and tragedy. Aurora's den was buried under layers of snow, a natural insulation against the biting cold. The team had strategically placed cameras to monitor her without disturbing her delicate state. These cameras were equipped with infrared capabilities, allowing the staff to see, even in the pitch-black conditions of the Arctic night. From the observation room, Dr. Elena Ruiz and Ethan Keller sat side by side, their eyes fixed on the monitors. Aurora was pacing within the den, her massive paws crunching softly against the snow-packed floor. Her breath came in heavy bursts, visible as faint puffs in the cold air. "She's restless," Elena observed, her brow furrowed. "That's a good sign. It means labor is starting." Ethan nodded but said nothing. His focus was on Aurora's movements, each step revealing a mix of tension and determination. The sanctuary was quiet, save for the occasional hum of the heaters and the muffled roar of the wind outside. Most of the staff had gone to their quarters, leaving Elena and Ethan to monitor Aurora through the night. The atmosphere in the room was thick with anticipation. Hours passed. Aurora's pacing grew more sporadic, interrupted by moments when she crouched low to the ground, her body tensing. Elena leaned closer to the screen, her heart racing with each contraction. "She's getting close," she whispered. Suddenly, Aurora stopped moving. She lay down on her side, her massive frame heaving with each breath. Her head rested on her paws, and for a moment, it seemed as though she had fallen asleep. But then her body tensed again, this time more violently. "It's happening," Ethan said, his voice breaking the heavy silence. On the monitor, Aurora pushed with a force that seemed to shake the small den. Moments later, a tiny figure emerged, covered in translucent skin and damp fur. The first cub was born. Elena let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "She did it," she said, her voice filled with relief. Aurora turned to the newborn, her massive tongue gently cleaning the fragile cub. The tiny creature let out its first squeaky cry, a sound so faint it barely registered on the microphones. The staff in the observation room exchanged quiet smiles, their worry momentarily replaced with joy. Aurora's labor wasn't over. Within minutes, she began pushing again. A second cub was born, slightly larger than the first, but just as fragile. Aurora repeated the process, licking the cub clean and nudging it close to her body for warmth. "She's amazing," Ethan said, his admiration evident. "After everything she's been through, she's doing this like a natural." But the moment of celebration was short-lived. Aurora's labor continued, and a third cub emerged. This one was noticeably smaller than its siblings. It didn't cry or move as the others had. Aurora nudged it gently, her massive nose prodding the motionless cub. "Something's wrong," Elena said, her voice tight with concern. On the screen, Aurora's behavior changed. She licked the tiny cub, trying to stimulate it, but it remained still. She pushed it closer to her body, as if willing it to come to life. Ethan leaned forward, his expression grim. "She knows something's not right." For the next hour, Aurora focused her attention on the lifeless cub, her instincts driving her to try everything she could to revive it. The other two cubs nestled against her belly, their faint movements and soft cries a stark contrast to the stillness of their sibling. Elena and Ethan watched in silence, torn between the urge to intervene and the understanding that this was a delicate moment. Any attempt to enter Aurora's den could put all the cubs at risk, not to mention provoke a dangerous reaction from their fiercely protective mother. As the hours dragged on, Aurora's exhaustion became evident. She curled around her two healthy cubs, her body heaving with each breath. The lifeless cub remained unmoving at her side. "We need to be ready," Elena said finally. "If that cub has any chance of survival, we might have to step in." Ethan nodded, though his expression remained conflicted. "Let's give her a little more time. She's already shown incredible instincts. Maybe she can pull this off." Outside, the Arctic wind howled, the sound echoing through the sanctuary like a mournful cry. Inside the observation room, the staff waited, their hearts heavy with the weight of the moment. Aurora, the Queen of the Ice, had already defied the odds by surviving years of captivity and giving birth to these cubs. But as the long Arctic night continued, it became clear that her greatest challenge was yet to come. The room was silent except for the faint hum of the observation equipment. Aurora lay in her den, curled protectively around her newborn cubs. The two larger ones were nestled against her belly, their tiny bodies moving with rhythmic breaths. The third cub, smaller and frailer, lay motionless at her side. The team in the observation room watched anxiously, their hopes clinging to every twitch and movement on the screen. Aurora stirred, her massive paw shifting gently to pull the lifeless cub closer. She nudged it repeatedly, her large nose prodding its fragile frame. Her instincts told her to keep trying, to coax life into the tiny body, but her efforts seemed in vain. Dr. Elena Ruiz glanced at Ethan Keller, her face etched with concern. "We need to make a decision," she said softly. "If we wait too long, it could be too late." Ethan hesitated, his gaze fixed on the monitor. "She's doing everything she can. If we go in now, we risk stressing her and endangering the other cubs." Elena sighed, torn between her professional training and her empathy for the struggling mother. Aurora's maternal instincts had already surpassed their expectations, but the fragile cub's condition made it clear that intervention might be the only chance it had. Minutes turned into an hour as Aurora continued to care for her cubs. The two healthy ones were thriving, squirming and nursing against her warm body. The third remained still, its tiny limbs limp and unresponsive. Aurora let out a low, mournful sound, a guttural noise that resonated through the microphones and sent chills through the staff. "She knows," Elena whispered. Ethan nodded grimly. "She knows, but she's not giving up." The sanctuary team convened in the observation room, a mixture of veterinarians, wildlife specialists, and volunteers. Each person carried a sense of urgency, tempered by the understanding of how delicate the situation was. They reviewed their options, weighing the risks of intervening against the possibility of losing the cub entirely. "We need to act," Elena finally said, her voice firm. "If we don't, this cub won't make it." Ethan agreed reluctantly, "But we have to do it carefully. If Aurora feels threatened, she could reject all of the cubs." The team sprang into action, preparing the tools and equipment they would need. A small portable incubator was readied, along with fluids and emergency medical supplies. Ethan and Elena would lead the intervention, approaching the den with slow, deliberate movements to minimize the risk of startling Aurora. As they stepped out into the freezing Arctic night, the wind howled around them, a relentless reminder of the harsh conditions that defined this remote sanctuary. Every step felt heavy with the weight of what they were about to do. When they reached the edge of Aurora's enclosure, they paused, observing her through the den's entrance. Aurora was alert, her sharp eyes watching their every move. Her massive body was curled protectively around the cubs, but her posture wasn't aggressive. "She's aware," Ethan said quietly, "but she's not acting defensive." Elena nodded. "Let's move slowly. She needs to know we're here to help." They approached the den cautiously, their movements calculated to avoid startling her. Aurora's gaze followed them, her dark eyes narrowing slightly. When they reached the entrance, she let out a soft growl. Not a warning, but a reminder that they were intruding on her space. Ethan knelt down, holding up his hands to show he meant no harm. "We're here to help," he said softly, knowing she wouldn't understand the words, but hoping she could sense his intent. Aurora shifted slightly, her massive frame tensing. For a moment, the team held their breath, unsure of what she would do. Then, to their surprise, she moved aside, giving them access to the tiny cub lying motionless at her side. "She's letting us," Elena said, her voice barely above a whisper. Carefully, Ethan reached into the den, his gloved hands cradling the fragile cub. Its body was alarmingly light, the sparse fur doing little to hide the visible bones beneath. The cub's breathing was shallow, its chest barely rising and falling. With Aurora watching intently, the team retreated to the observation room, carrying the cub to the waiting incubator. The atmosphere was tense as they worked quickly to stabilize it. Elena administered fluids while another staff member monitored its temperature. "Come on, little one," Elena murmured, her focus unwavering. Hours passed as the team worked tirelessly to save the cub. Aurora remained in her den, tending to her two healthy cubs, but frequently glancing toward the observation room. Her low growls and occasional restless movements reminded the team of the risks they had taken. Finally, the cub's condition began to stabilize. Its breathing became more regular, and its tiny body showed faint signs of movement. The team named the cub Tundra, a nod to the harsh environment it had been born into, and the strength it would need to survive. Ethan leaned back, relief washing over him. "We've given it a chance," he said. Elena nodded, though her expression remained cautious. "It's not out of the woods yet, but it's a fighter." Back in the den, Aurora seemed to sense that something had changed. She settled down with her two cubs, her body language calm but watchful. The sanctuary's long Arctic night continued, but for the first time, there was a glimmer of hope. Aurora's den had grown quieter, but the tension in the observation room had not eased. The tiny cub, now named Tundra, lay in a heated incubator, its fragile body finally showing signs of life. The team had done all they could for now, but their thoughts lingered on Aurora, still in her den with her two healthy cubs. The question on everyone's mind was the same. How would she react to Tundra's absence? Aurora's maternal instincts remained strong. Through the cameras, the team watched as she groomed her remaining cubs, nudging them closer for warmth. Yet, every so often, her gaze would shift to the den's entrance, her ears twitching at the faint sounds from outside. It was clear she knew one of her cubs was missing. "She's restless," Ethan said, leaning back in his chair. His eyes were fixed on the monitor, where Aurora had begun pacing in tight circles. "She's searching," Elena replied, her tone somber. "She knows something isn't right." The staff gathered in the observation room to discuss their next steps. Tundra was stable for now, but its condition remained critical. The team had to ensure it received around-the-clock care, including tube feeding and monitoring its temperature. Yet, keeping Tundra away from Aurora posed another challenge. The bond between a mother polar bear and her cubs was essential for their survival. Too much time apart could lead to rejection, even if Tundra recovered. "We can't keep them separated for long," Ethan said, voicing the concern that everyone shared. "If Aurora doesn't accept Tundra when we reintroduce it, all of this will have been for nothing." Elena nodded. "But if we try to reintroduce Tundra too soon, we risk stressing Aurora and jeopardizing the other cubs." It was a delicate balance, and every decision carried immense risks. The team decided to give Tundra 48 hours of care before attempting a reintroduction. In the meantime, they would closely monitor Aurora's behavior and look for signs of acceptance. As the hours passed, Tundra's condition began to improve. Its once shallow breathing grew stronger, and its tiny limbs, though weak, started to move. The staff worked in shifts, feeding the cub every 2 hours and ensuring its incubator maintained a constant temperature. Each small milestone brought a wave of cautious optimism. Elena was on one of her late-night shifts when she noticed Tundra trying to lift its head. It was a small movement, barely noticeable, but it filled her with hope. "You're a fighter, aren't you?" she whispered, watching as the tiny cub let out a faint squeak. The next morning, the team prepared to check on Aurora and her cubs. They approached her enclosure carefully, aware of the risks of getting too close. Aurora's massive frame was visible through the den's entrance, her golden eyes fixed on the humans as they moved. "She's watching us closely," Ethan said, his voice low. Aurora didn't growl or show signs of aggression, but her posture remained tense. It was clear she was on high alert, her protective instincts in overdrive. Back in the observation room, the cameras showed Aurora interacting with her cubs. She continued grooming and nursing them, her movements deliberate and precise. Yet, there were moments when she paused, her gaze lingering on the spot where Tundra had been. "She hasn't forgotten," Elena said, noting the subtle signs of Aurora's awareness. "That's a good thing. It means she might still accept Tundra." By the second night, Tundra's condition had stabilized enough for the team to consider the next step. The cub's breathing was steady, and it had begun to show more movement, albeit weakly. The decision was made to reintroduce Tundra to Aurora and her siblings. The team knew the risks. If Aurora rejected Tundra, it could lead to aggression, endangering all three cubs. The reintroduction had to be done carefully, with contingency plans in place for every possible outcome. The following morning, the sanctuary was eerily quiet as the team gathered near Aurora's enclosure. Tundra, wrapped in a soft, insulated blanket, was carried in a small carrier. Ethan and Elena would handle the reintroduction, while the rest of the team watched from the observation room. As they approached the den, Aurora stirred, her sharp eyes locking on to the humans. She let out a low growl, a sound that sent shivers down Ethan's spine. "She's nervous," he said, pausing just outside the den. Elena nodded. "Let's give her a moment to adjust." They waited, letting Aurora settle before carefully placing Tundra at the den's entrance. The tiny cub let out a faint cry, its weak voice barely audible over the wind. Aurora's ears twitched, and her growl subsided. She sniffed the air, her massive nose quivering as she caught Tundra's scent. The moment was tense, every second stretching into an eternity. Aurora moved slowly, her massive frame blocking the den's entrance as she approached Tundra. She lowered her head, her nose brushing against the cub's tiny body. The team held their breath, unsure of what would happen next. To their relief, Aurora began to nudge Tundra gently, her movements cautious but deliberate. She let out a soft rumble, a sound that seemed to resonate with acceptance. Then, with surprising gentleness, she picked up the cub by the scruff of its neck and carried it back into the den. "She accepted it," Elena whispered, her voice filled with awe. In the observation room, the team erupted in quiet cheers. On the screen, Aurora was seen placing Tundra next to her other cubs, her massive paw pulling all three close. The reintroduction was a success, but the journey was far from over. Tundra still faced an uphill battle for survival, and Aurora's resilience would be tested in the days to come. The storm outside raged on, a relentless wind that howled across the Arctic plains. Inside Aurora's den, things had settled for the moment. The cameras revealed the polar bear lying with her cubs nestled tightly against her. Tundra, though weak, had been fully accepted back into the fold, and the team watched with cautious relief as Aurora gently nudged her smallest cub into position for warmth. But the reintroduction was just the beginning. The team knew that Tundra's survival depended not only on Aurora's instincts, but also on the delicate balance between intervention and letting nature take its course. The sanctuary staff began round-the-clock monitoring, ready to act if Tundra's condition deteriorated again. "That was the easy part," Dr. Elena Ruiz said, her voice laced with exhaustion as she addressed the team during a morning briefing. "Now we have to make sure Tundra thrives. And that means giving Aurora the space to do her job while staying ready to step in if necessary." Ethan Keller nodded, his brow furrowed with concern. "We'll need to monitor their interactions closely. If the other cubs outcompete Tundra for milk or warmth, it could set us back." The sanctuary's cameras provided a detailed view of Aurora's den. Over the next few days, the team observed her carefully. Aurora's maternal instincts were undeniable. She groomed all three cubs with precision, her massive tongue gently stimulating their fragile bodies. Yet Tundra's frailty was apparent. While the other two cubs squirmed energetically and nursed vigorously, Tundra struggled to latch onto Aurora's fur-covered belly for milk. "She's trying," Elena said one afternoon, watching as Tundra fought to stay in position. "But she's just not strong enough." The team debated whether to intervene again, weighing the risks of taking Tundra away for supplemental feeding against the importance of maintaining the bond with Aurora. After much discussion, they decided on a compromise, a supplemental feeding device that could be discreetly introduced into the den. It was a risky operation. The device, designed to mimic Aurora's natural scent, was carefully prepared and attached to the den's entrance. The team hoped that Aurora would accept it as part of her environment and allow Tundra to use it without disrupting the delicate family dynamics. The first attempt was met with mixed results. Aurora, ever the vigilant mother, noticed the new addition immediately. She sniffed it cautiously, her ears flattening as she let out a low growl. The team held their breath, watching from the observation room as she circled the device. "Come on, Aurora," Ethan murmured under his breath. Finally, after several tense moments, Aurora seemed to accept the device. She returned to her cubs, nudging them closer to her body. Tundra, still weak but persistent, was soon guided toward the supplemental feeding station by the team's remote-controlled mechanism. The first time Tundra latched onto the device, Elena let out a sigh of relief. "It's working," she said, her voice barely audible over the quiet hum of the monitors. The days that followed were a test of patience and precision. The supplemental feeding device was used sparingly, ensuring Tundra received enough nourishment to grow stronger without disrupting the natural feeding dynamic between Aurora and her cubs. Each feeding session was monitored closely, and adjustments were made based on Tundra's progress. Aurora, for her part, seemed to adapt to the new routine. Though she remained wary of the humans outside her enclosure, her focus stayed on her cubs. The team marveled at her resilience and adaptability, traits that had undoubtedly carried her through years of captivity and now served her as a mother in the harsh Arctic environment. As the week progressed, signs of improvement began to emerge. Tundra's once limp movements grew stronger, and its faint cries became louder and more frequent. The tiny cub began to hold its own against its siblings, squirming into better positions during feeding times and nudging its way closer to Aurora's warmth. "She's a fighter," Ethan said one evening, watching, as Tundra managed to nudge one of her larger siblings aside to nurse. Elena smiled. "She gets that from her mother." Despite the progress, the team remained vigilant. The Arctic environment was unforgiving, and even the slightest setback could spell disaster for Tundra. The sanctuary's harsh conditions tested not only the animals, but also the humans dedicated to their care. One particularly cold night, the temperatures outside dropped to record lows, and the winds howled so fiercely that the walls of the observation room seemed to tremble. Inside Aurora's den, the cameras showed her curled tightly around her cubs, her massive body acting as a living barrier against the cold. "She's incredible," Elena said, her voice filled with admiration. Ethan nodded. "She's doing everything she can. We just have to keep supporting her." As the storm raged on, Tundra continued to grow stronger. The team watched as the tiny cub, once frail and lifeless, began to exhibit the playful curiosity that polar bear cubs are known for. It batted weakly at its siblings, its tiny paws swiping clumsily at the air. The sight brought a rare moment of joy to the team. For the first time, they allowed themselves to believe that Tundra might have a chance. But they knew the journey was far from over. The Arctic was an unpredictable and often merciless place, and the fight for survival was never truly won. Aurora's bond with her cubs had become the sanctuary's lifeline of hope, a reminder that even in the harshest conditions, resilience and care could create miracles. As the storm outside began to wane, the team prepared for the next phase of their journey with Aurora and her cubs. The Queen of the Ice had proven her strength once again, but the challenges ahead would demand even more from her, and from those determined to see her family thrive. The Arctic storm had passed, leaving the sanctuary cloaked in a blanket of fresh snow. Inside Aurora's den, the faint hum of life continued. Through the observation cameras, the team watched as she nursed her cubs, her body a fortress of warmth and protection. Tundra, though still smaller than its siblings, had begun to show signs of resilience. The little cub fought for space, its movements more coordinated and deliberate than they had been just days earlier. Dr. Elena Ruiz leaned forward in her chair, studying the screen intently. "She's doing it," she murmured. "Tundra's holding her own." Ethan Keller stood beside her, his arms crossed. "For now," he replied cautiously. "But she's got a long way to go. We can't let our guard down." Tundra's survival was far from guaranteed. The Arctic environment, even within the sanctuary's controlled habitat, was unforgiving. Aurora's instincts had proven vital, but there were still moments when the smaller cubs struggled to keep up. The sanctuary team remained vigilant, balancing their hands-off approach with strategic interventions. One of the biggest challenges was feeding. Despite Tundra's growing strength, it often found itself jostled aside by its larger siblings during nursing sessions. Aurora, though attentive, couldn't always ensure equal access for all three cubs. The team decided to increase the use of the supplemental feeding device. It was a delicate operation, requiring precise timing to ensure Tundra received the nourishment it needed without disrupting the natural bond between Aurora and her cubs. Each feeding session was monitored closely, with Elena and Ethan taking turns supervising the process. "Tundra's appetite is improving," Elena noted during one session, watching as the tiny cub latched onto the device with surprising determination. "She's got fight in her." Ethan smiled faintly.
She's definitely Aurora's cub.
The team's work extended beyond feeding. They implemented measures to strengthen Tundra's fragile body, including brief periods of gentle stimulation to encourage muscle development. These sessions were carefully timed to coincide with Aurora's moments of rest, ensuring the mother bear wasn't alarmed by their presence. As the days turned into weeks, Tundra's progress became more apparent. Its once sparse fur had thickened, and its pale, fragile body began to fill out. The cub's movements grew more confident, and its cries, once weak and barely audible, now carried a sharper, more assertive tone. "It's incredible," Elena said one morning, watching Tundra on the monitor. The tiny cub was playfully pawing at one of its siblings, its small frame trembling with effort, but refusing to back down. Ethan nodded, his expression softening. She's catching up. Slowly, but she's catching up. Despite the progress, the team knew they couldn't afford to become complacent. The Arctic was unpredictable, and even the smallest setback could have devastating consequences. The sanctuary's weather monitoring equipment predicted another storm on the horizon, one that threatened to test the limits of their preparations. As the storm approached, the team doubled their efforts to ensure Aurora and her cubs were as secure as possible. They reinforced the den's outer structure, adding layers of insulation to protect against the biting winds and plummeting temperatures. Additional heaters were placed near the observation room, ready to be deployed if the storm worsened. When the storm hit, it was even more intense than anticipated. The wind howled like a living thing, shaking the walls of the sanctuary and obscuring the landscape in a swirling blur of snow. Inside the observation room, the team worked tirelessly, monitoring Aurora and her cubs through the cameras. Aurora, ever the vigilant mother, adjusted her position to shield her cubs from the cold. Her massive body curled tightly around them, creating a cocoon of warmth. Tundra, nestled between its siblings, seemed to sense the storm's ferocity. The tiny cub clung to its mother, its small paws pressed against her thick fur.
"She's remarkable," Elena said, her voice filled with awe. "She's holding everything together."
Ethan nodded, his gaze fixed on the screen. She knows what to do. She always has. The storm raged on for 2 days, its fury unrelenting. The sanctuary staff took shifts, ensuring the equipment remained functional and the cubs were closely monitored. When the storm finally subsided, it left behind a stark, pristine landscape, a world of white that seemed untouched by life. Inside the den, Aurora and her cubs had weathered the storm. The cameras showed her stretching her massive frame, her movements slow but steady. The cubs, still huddled against her, began to stir, their tiny bodies wriggling with renewed energy. Tundra, though smaller than the others, was among the first to move. The little cub let out a sharp cry, its head lifting to survey its surroundings. The team watched in amazement as Tundra began to crawl toward its siblings, its movements wobbly but determined. "She's a survivor," Elena said, her voice tinged with emotion. Ethan smiled. "She's more than that. She's thriving." The storm had been a test, not just for Aurora and her cubs, but for the sanctuary staff as well. It underscored the fragility of life in the Arctic and the incredible strength required to endure its challenges. As the sanctuary returned to its routine, the team couldn't help but feel a renewed sense of hope. Tundra's fight for survival was far from over, but with every passing day, the little cub proved that even in the harshest conditions, life could find a way. The Arctic sun lingered low on the horizon, casting a pale golden light across the sanctuary. Inside Aurora's den, life was stirring in earnest. Tundra, the cub that had once seemed destined to fail, was now growing stronger with each passing day. Its movements, once feeble and uncertain, were now deliberate, and its cries carried a force that surprised even the seasoned sanctuary staff. But Tundra's journey to full recovery was not yet complete. While it had made strides in strength and coordination, its bond with Aurora and its siblings was still fragile. The team knew that nurturing this bond was crucial for Tundra's development, not just physically, but emotionally. Reintroducing Tundra to a more active role in the den, without relying as much on supplemental feeding or human care, was the next critical step. In the observation room, Dr. Elena Ruiz and Ethan Keller reviewed the latest footage. The cubs were becoming more active, their playful interactions filling the den with energy. Tundra, however, was often on the periphery, hesitant to join its siblings' roughhousing. "She's still a little behind," Elena observed, her brow furrowed. "We need to help her integrate more. The bond between them is important for her survival." Ethan nodded. We've done what we can to keep her alive. Now it's up to Aurora and the cubs to bring her into the fold. The team decided to begin phasing out the supplemental feeding device. It had been a lifeline for Tundra, ensuring it received enough nourishment, but it was time for the cub to rely more on Aurora. They adjusted their schedules to allow for closer observation, prepared to intervene if necessary. The transition wasn't without its challenges. Tundra struggled at first, often pushed aside by its larger siblings during feeding times. Aurora, however, seemed to recognize the need to give her smallest cub extra attention. The team watched in awe as she used her massive paws to gently reposition Tundra, ensuring it had access to her milk. "She's incredible," Elena said one afternoon, her voice tinged with admiration. "She knows exactly what Tundra needs." Over the next week, the cubs became more adventurous, exploring the confines of the den and testing their growing strength. Tundra, though still the smallest, began to mimic its siblings' behavior. It pounced clumsily on snow-covered ridges inside the den, its tiny paws swiping at imaginary prey. The team couldn't help but cheer quietly as they watched the little cub find its place in the family. Aurora's behavior also began to change. She became more active, leaving the den for brief periods to stretch and explore the habitat. These moments of separation were brief but significant, signaling that she trusted the safety of her cubs. The team used these opportunities to assess the den's condition and ensure it remained secure against the elements. One particularly memorable moment came when Aurora returned to the den after a short outing. The cubs, sensing her presence, let out a chorus of cries. Tundra was the first to waddle toward her, its small frame trembling with excitement. Aurora lowered her massive head and nuzzled Tundra, a gesture so tender that it brought tears to the eyes of the staff watching from the observation room.
"She's fully accepted her," Ethan said, his voice filled with relief.
The reintroduction process was working, but the team remained cautious. They knew that Tundra's long-term survival depended on more than just its bond with Aurora. The cub needed to grow stronger, faster, and more resilient to face the challenges of Arctic life. As the cubs grew bolder, Aurora began leading them outside the den for brief excursions. These outings were critical for their development, exposing them to the harsh environment and teaching them the skills they would need to survive. Tundra often lagged behind, its smaller frame struggling to keep up with its siblings. During one outing, the cameras captured a moment of both tension and triumph. Aurora had led the cubs to a small, snow-covered ridge within the enclosure. The two larger cubs scrambled up the incline with ease, but Tundra hesitated at the base, its tiny paws sinking into the deep snow. The team watched nervously as Tundra attempted to climb, slipping and sliding with each step. Aurora, standing at the top of the ridge, let out a low growl, an encouragement rather than a warning. Tundra paused, its ears twitching at the sound, before mustering its strength and trying again. Finally, after several attempts, Tundra reached the top. Aurora nuzzled the cub briefly before leading all three back to the den. "That's a milestone," Elena said, her voice filled with pride. "She's learning to push herself." The cubs' excursions became more frequent, each one testing their limits and building their strength. Tundra, once the weakest of the litter, began to hold its own. It still trailed behind at times, but its determination was undeniable. In the observation room, the team marveled at the transformation. Tundra's survival had been uncertain from the start, but with Aurora's unwavering care and the sanctuary's support, the little cub was defying the odds.
"Every day she grows stronger," Ethan said. "She's proving that she belongs here."
As the Arctic sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the snow, Aurora and her cubs returned to the den. Inside, they huddled together, their breaths creating small clouds in the frigid air. Tundra nestled between its siblings, its small frame warm and secure. The reintroduction was complete, but the journey was far from over. The sanctuary staff knew that Aurora and her cubs would face new challenges as they prepared for the next phase of their lives. Yet, in that moment, there was hope, a testament to the strength of a mother's love and the resilience of the tiniest survivor. The Arctic began its slow transition into spring. Days stretched longer, casting pale light over the sanctuary's frozen landscape. Snow still blanketed the ground, but the biting cold softened, allowing brief glimpses of the rugged earth below. For Aurora and her cubs, this change signaled a time of exploration and growth, a period when their bonds and instincts would be tested. Inside the den, life was bustling. Tundra, now stronger and more active, had become an integral part of the family. No longer content to stay on the edges, the smallest cub often initiated playful tussles with its siblings, its tiny growls and swipes a testament to its newfound confidence. "She's not just surviving," Dr. Elena Ruiz said during a morning briefing. "She's thriving. Look at her. She's holding her own." The team watched on the monitors as Tundra wrestled with one of the larger cubs, its movements clumsy but determined. Aurora observed the play with calm attentiveness, her massive frame stretched across the den's entrance. Occasionally, she would intervene with a gentle nudge or growl, ensuring that the play didn't escalate into aggression. "She's teaching them," Ethan Keller said, his admiration for Aurora evident. "Every movement, every sound, it's all a lesson." Aurora's role as a mother was critical during this stage. Polar bear cubs learn essential survival skills through observation and play, mimicking their mother's actions and behaviors. The sanctuary's cameras captured Aurora, demonstrating how to dig for hidden food caches and how to navigate the uneven terrain of their enclosure. Her cubs followed her every move, their curiosity and energy pushing them to explore further each day. For Tundra, these lessons were vital. Though it remained smaller than its siblings, the tiny cub's determination to keep up was unwavering. During one session, Aurora led her cubs to a shallow pond at the edge of the enclosure. The ice had begun to thaw, creating small patches of open water. The two larger cubs waded in eagerly, their paws splashing in the icy water. Tundra hesitated at the edge, its small frame trembling as it peered into the unfamiliar surface. Aurora turned, her sharp eyes meeting Tundra's. She let out a low rumble, encouraging her smallest cub to follow. Tundra stepped forward tentatively, its tiny paws sinking into the slush. The cold seemed to shock the cub at first, and it let out a startled cry. Aurora approached, nuzzling Tundra gently and guiding it further into the water. The team watched from the observation room, holding their breath as the cub took another step, then another.
"She's doing it,"
Elena whispered, a smile spreading across her face. Tundra waded into the shallow water, its movements hesitant but determined. Its siblings splashed around playfully, their excitement infectious. Soon, Tundra joined in, pawing at the rippling surface and letting out tiny growls of delight. The sight brought a wave of relief and joy to the team. Tundra's hesitance had been replaced by confidence, a sign that the cub was not only physically stronger, but also emotionally resilient. As the weeks passed, the cub's outings grew longer and more adventurous. Aurora led them across the enclosure's ridges and slopes, teaching them to navigate the challenging terrain. Tundra often lagged behind, but its persistence never wavered. The little cub would scramble to catch up, its small paws digging into the snow with every step. One particularly memorable outing occurred on a clear, crisp morning. Aurora had led her cubs to a large mound of snow at the edge of the habitat. The two larger cubs reached the top quickly, their playful growls echoing through the air. Tundra, as always, trailed behind. The cameras captured the moment as the small cub began its ascent. The slope was steep, and Tundra slipped several times, its tiny body sliding back with each failed attempt. Aurora watched from the top, her gaze steady but encouraging. Finally, with one last push, Tundra reached the summit. The cub let out a triumphant cry, its tiny form standing tall against the snowy backdrop. Aurora approached, nuzzling Tundra with a gesture that seemed to say, "You did it." "That's a turning point," Ethan said, his voice filled with pride. "She's proving herself every day." Back in the den, the cub's playful energy filled the space with warmth. Tundra had grown bolder, often initiating games and tussles with its siblings. The bond between the three cubs was undeniable, a connection forged through shared struggles and triumphs. Aurora's patience and guidance remained unwavering. She taught her cubs how to dig through snow for hidden food, how to stay close in the biting wind, and how to respond to the sounds and scents of their environment. Every lesson was a building block, preparing them for the challenges they would face in the wild. For the sanctuary staff, watching the family thrive was a deeply rewarding experience. Tundra's journey from frailty to strength had become a symbol of resilience, not just for the team, but for everyone who followed the sanctuary's work. The story of Aurora and her cubs had drawn attention from around the world. A live stream of their enclosure garnered thousands of viewers daily, and donations poured in to support the sanctuary's mission. The team used these resources to enhance the cubs' habitat, ensuring they had every opportunity to grow and thrive. As the days grew longer and the snow began to recede, Aurora and her cubs prepared for the next chapter of their journey. For Tundra, every step was a testament to the strength of a mother's love and the unyielding will to survive. But the Arctic remained an unpredictable and unforgiving place. As spring turned to summer, new challenges awaited the family, tests that would push them to their limits and prove just how far they had come. The Arctic summer was brief, but it brought a surge of life to the frozen wilderness. The sun hovered high in the sky, casting long, golden rays across the sanctuary. The snow began to melt, exposing rocky outcrops and sparse vegetation. For Aurora and her cubs, this was a season of opportunity and growth, a chance to prepare for the challenges that lay ahead. Tundra had transformed from a fragile newborn into a lively young cub. Though it was still smaller than its siblings, its determination and energy had closed much of the gap. The once quiet den was now filled with the sounds of playful growls and the scrape of paws against snow and rock. "She's come so far," Dr. Elena Ruiz said, her voice tinged with pride as she watched Tundra chase one of its siblings around a ridge. "She's a fighter in every sense of the word." Ethan Keller nodded, his gaze fixed on the monitor. "Aurora deserves the credit. She never gave up on her." Aurora's dedication as a mother had been nothing short of extraordinary. She had taught her cubs how to navigate the harsh environment, how to forage for food, and how to stay safe in the unpredictable Arctic landscape. The cameras often captured her leading the cubs on excursions, her massive frame moving with a purpose as her offspring followed closely behind. One morning, the team observed Aurora teaching her cubs how to fish in a shallow stream that ran through the enclosure. The water, freed from the ice by the summer sun, sparkled under the bright light. Aurora waded into the stream with her powerful paws, her movements slow and deliberate. The cubs watched from the bank, their curiosity evident in the way they tilted their heads and sniffed the air. Aurora demonstrated by swiping her paw into the water, creating ripples that disturbed the surface. Her cubs hesitated at first, but soon the two larger ones joined her, splashing clumsily as they tried to mimic her movements. Tundra lingered on the bank, its small frame quivering with hesitation. "Come on, little one," Elena said softly, as though willing Tundra to take the leap. After a moment of watching its siblings, Tundra stepped into the water. The cold startled the cub, and it let out a small yelp, but Aurora turned and nuzzled her smallest cub, encouraging it to try again. With renewed determination, Tundra waded deeper, its tiny paws creating ripples as it attempted to fish. "It's incredible," Ethan said, smiling as Tundra swiped at the water with growing confidence. By the end of the session, all three cubs were soaked but triumphant, their playful splashing and tiny growls filling the air. Aurora led them back to the den, her slow, steady pace matching the tired but satisfied energy of her cubs. The sanctuary team watched with a mixture of pride and awe. Tundra's journey from a frail, motionless newborn to an active, thriving cub was nothing short of a miracle. Aurora's role in that journey was a testament to the power of maternal instincts and resilience. As summer progressed, the cubs became more independent. They ventured farther from the den, exploring the boundaries of their enclosure and testing their growing strength. Tundra, once hesitant and timid, now often led the way, its curiosity and adventurous spirit shining through. The team began preparations for the family's eventual transition to a larger, semi-wild habitat designed to mimic the Arctic tundra. This space would give Aurora and her cubs the freedom to roam and hunt, providing a crucial step toward potential reintroduction into the wild. On the day of the move, the sanctuary was abuzz with activity. The staff worked carefully to ensure the transition was as smooth and stress-free as possible. Aurora watched the activity with her usual calm vigilance, her golden eyes following the humans as they secured the transport enclosure. The move was a success. The new habitat, expansive and teeming with natural features, gave Aurora and her cubs the space to thrive. The family quickly adapted, with Aurora leading the cubs on explorations of their new surroundings. For Tundra, the larger habitat was an opportunity to prove its resilience. The cub tackled every challenge with enthusiasm, whether it was climbing rocky outcrops or foraging in hidden snowbanks. Its siblings often followed its lead, their playful interactions a testament to the strong bond they had formed. The sanctuary's live stream captured these moments, drawing thousands of viewers from around the world. Donations continued to pour in, helping the sanctuary expand its efforts to protect endangered species and provide second chances for animals like Aurora and her cubs. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Aurora and her cubs stood on a ridge overlooking the sanctuary. The cameras captured the moment, Aurora's massive frame silhouetted against the fading light, her cubs huddled close by her side. Tundra, smaller but no less confident, stood at the front, its vivid blue eyes scanning the horizon. "It's a symbol," Elena said, her voice filled with emotion as she watched the scene. "A reminder of what's possible when we don't give up." Ethan nodded. "Aurora and Tundra, they've shown us that even in the harshest conditions, life finds a way." As the family disappeared into the twilight, the sanctuary team reflected on the journey they had witnessed. Aurora, the queen of the ice, had defied the odds, raising her cubs in an environment that demanded strength, resilience, and unwavering determination. Tundra, the smallest and most vulnerable, had become a beacon of hope, a reminder that miracles could happen, even in the most unforgiving corners of the world. And while the Arctic remained unpredictable and challenging, one thing was certain: Aurora and her cubs were ready for whatever lay ahead.